The most dangerous man in Seoul hadn't moved in 40 seconds. That's what the bodyguards noticed first. Not the woman in white walking through the ballroom doors. Not the little girl clutching her hand. Not the way 800 powerful people went suddenly, collectively silent. They noticed that Kang Min-jae, the man who had once ordered an entire building emptied in under 3 minutes just because someone mispronounced his name, had simply stopped. Glass in hand, jaw locked, eyes fixed on something across the room like he'd just seen the ghost of every wrong decision he'd ever made walk back through the door wearing diamonds. Then the little girl looked up, and Kang Min-jae forgot how to breathe. This is the story of what happens when power has no answer for the truth. When pride costs a man everything, and when the woman he destroyed comes back, not for revenge, not for reconciliation, but simply because Seoul wasn't big enough to avoid fate forever. If this story finds you tonight, stay until the end. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Black Orchid Gala happened once a year, and every year it was the same performance. 800 people dressed in money, drinking money, networking with money, all pretending the city outside the glass walls of the Han Mirage Hotel didn't exist. Politicians stood beside businessmen who stood beside people who moved things across borders that couldn't legally be named on paper. The crystal chandeliers threw gold light across silk lapels and diamond necklaces and carefully arranged smiles that never reached the eyes. A 12-piece orchestra played something European and forgettable from a raised stage near the back. Waiters moved through the crowd like shadows with silver trays. It was Seoul's most elegant lie, performed annually, attended by people who understood that the performance was the point. Kang Min-jae had attended every year for the past 9 years. He stood now at the private whiskey bar along the eastern wall, a deliberate position that gave him a clear sightline to both the main entrance and the terrace exits, with a glass of Yamazaki 25 resting in his right hand and absolutely nothing resting on his face. 41 years old, 6 feet of controlled stillness in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Short dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been sculpted by someone with a grudge against softness, and eyes that had seen the inside of enough desperate situations that they'd stopped flinching somewhere around his early 30s. Beside him stood Chairman O of KH Industrial, droning on about a port investment deal in Busan that Min-jae had already decided he wasn't interested in 3 sentences ago. The land acquisition phase is essentially complete, Chairman O was saying, swirling his glass like a professor making a point. The question now is transit infrastructure. If the northern bypass gets approved in the spring budget, then our window for initial capital placement narrows significantly, which is why I wanted to discuss the Crimson Serpent's position on give the proposal to Ji Wook, Min-jae said. He handles infrastructure vetting. Chairman O blinked. Of course. Yes. I just thought given the sensitivity of the Ji Wook. The chairman stopped talking, nodded, took a step back. Min-jae lifted his glass and let his eyes drift across the room, not because he was interested in anything he saw, but because watching a room was a habit so deeply embedded in him it happened below the level of conscious thought. He tracked exits, counted familiar faces against unfamiliar ones, noted which conversations had shifted posture in the last few minutes and which hadn't. It was the kind of attention that kept men like him alive. Which was why, when the ballroom doors opened at 9:47 and the crowd near the entrance rippled like something had disturbed still water, he noticed immediately. He noticed before the murmurs started, before the small cluster of guests near the doors parted and turned, before the silence began spreading like a slow bleed across the room from east to west, table by table, conversation by conversation, until 800 people had gone quiet without anyone announcing why. Min-jae set his glass down on the bar. She walked through the doors in white. Not cream, not ivory. White. Stark, deliberate. The kind of white that didn't belong at a Seoul underworld gala unless the person wearing it wanted to make a point. The dress was floor-length, structured at the shoulders, and it did absolutely nothing to hide the fact that the woman wearing it had spent 3 years building herself into someone the room didn't have the vocabulary to handle. Nia Laurent. She was taller than Min-jae remembered, or maybe it was the way she held herself now. Head lifted, stride steady, eyes forward, not searching the room, not performing for it. She moved like someone who had already decided how the evening was going to go and had come anyway. Her dark skin caught the chandelier light and threw it back differently, richer somehow, the diamond earrings at her ears flickering like cold fire against deep ebony. Her natural hair was pulled up in a way that took skill to look that effortless. She was the most beautiful woman in the room, and she knew it, and she didn't care. But it wasn't Nia that stopped him. It was the little girl, 4 years old, maybe just past it, dressed in a pale lavender coat that had clearly been chosen by someone who loved her. Small pearl buttons, a white collar, patent shoes that clicked softly against the marble floor. She walked beside Nia with the slightly dazed expression of a child who had been kept up past her bedtime for something a grown-up had decided was important. Her hand was wrapped tightly around two of Nia's fingers. Then she looked up, not at the room, not at the chandeliers or the crowd or the orchestra, at him. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe across a crowded ballroom a 4-year-old had simply looked in a direction. But the moment their eyes met, Min-jae felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Something seismic and quiet at the same time, like a wall cracking from the inside without any sound. Because the little girl looking at him from across the ballroom had his eyes. Not similar, not vaguely reminiscent. His eyes, exactly. That specific shade of dark that everyone who'd ever stared him down described afterward as unsettling, the slightly upward tilt at the outer corners. The steadiness. The sense of someone seeing more than they were supposed to see. His glass was on the bar. He didn't remember putting it down. "Mr. Kang?" Ji-wook's voice somewhere to his left. "Sir?" He didn't answer. Across the room, Nia Laurent finally let her gaze sweep the crowd, moving through it with the calm efficiency of someone who had already prepared for every version of this moment. When her eyes found him, they didn't widen. They didn't fill with something desperate or trembling. They simply settled, like she'd known exactly where he'd be standing, like she'd calculated it already. And then, very slowly, she looked away. Back toward the hostess moving forward to greet her, back toward her daughter, back toward the room. And Kang Min-jae understood something in that single second that would take him weeks to fully process. She hadn't come here running from him. She wasn't afraid. She was here because she'd decided to be. On her own terms, by her own rules, and the little girl in the lavender coat was part of that decision. The night became something Min-jae had to perform his way through. He shook hands and nodded at the right moments and said the correct things to the correct people, and let Ji-wook handle the two conversations that needed actual attention. He drank one more Yamazaki, slowly, and kept his position near the bar because moving too early would tell the room something about the state of him he wasn't willing to share. But his eyes kept finding her. Not obsessively, not the way they once had. Years ago, in another version of his life, he'd tracked Nia Laurent the way a hunting dog tracks something it can't stop wanting. That had been a different kind of watching. Hungry. Possessive in a way he hadn't recognized as the problem it was until much later. This was different. This was the watching of a man trying to understand the arithmetic of what he was seeing. He watched her work the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had arrived without needing validation from it. She spoke to Minister Cho of Trade Relations for 7 minutes. He tracked it. And whatever she said made Cho lean forward twice and laugh once in a way that wasn't performative. She accepted a glass of sparkling water and never replaced it with wine. She introduced herself to people he'd never seen her speak to before, which meant she'd built a network here that had nothing to do with him, which meant she'd been back in Korea longer than anyone had told him, which meant his intelligence apparatus, the finest private network in the country, had been deliberately in the dark. Someone had helped her stay hidden. He filed that away. The little girl, his daughter, his mind kept snagging on that word like fabric on wire, had been taken somewhere quieter by a woman who appeared to be a personal aide. He'd seen them disappear through a side door near the terrace around 10 o'clock. The child had been half asleep by then, head resting against the aide's shoulder, one small hand still loosely curled like she was holding something that wasn't there. He needed to stop thinking about her hands. At 10:45, Nia was standing near the terrace entrance speaking with two women he didn't recognize when she glanced across the room and found him watching. This time, neither of them looked away. The distance between them was perhaps 30 meters. It might as well have been 30 years. He didn't approach her that night. It wasn't strategy, or it wasn't entirely strategy. It was the specific paralysis that comes from knowing that the thing you're about to say cannot be unsaid, and that the ground beneath the conversation is not stable, and that you have been wrong in a way that doesn't have a clean solution. He went home at midnight. He sat in the back of his car for 11 minutes in the Han Mirage underground garage before his driver realized he hadn't asked to move yet. "Mr. Kang, where are we?" "The estate." He stared out the window during the 20-minute drive and thought about a child's eyes in a crowded room and said nothing else. The investigation took 6 days. Min Jae gave the order to Park Hyun-seok, head of the Crimson Serpent's private intelligence division, at 7 the morning after the gala, and he gave it in the kind of voice he reserved for things that needed to be taken seriously enough that nobody asked follow-up questions. "Reopen the Laurent file from 3 years ago," he said. "Everything. Original source materials, chain of custody on every piece of evidence. I want financial forensics on the transfer records, and I want independent eyes on the photographs. Nobody outside this office sees the results until I do." Park had been with him long enough to recognize when the directive was a test. This one wasn't. He nodded and left without asking why. The results came back in stages. The first stage arrived on day 3. Min Jae read it alone in his private office, the door locked, the lights down, his phone silenced. The financial forensics report was 22 pages. He read every one of them twice. The forged transfer documents that had supposedly shown Nia redirecting syndicate funds to foreign accounts. Documents he had believed, documents he had presented as evidence at the gala 3 years ago in front of 200 witnesses, had been constructed using internal data that only 3 people in the entire organization had access to at the time. 3 people. He was one of them. The second person was his chief financial architect, who had died of a cardiac event 8 months after the gala. Natural causes, fully documented. The third person was Serena Vale. He closed the report, sat for a while, opened it again, and read the same section 3 more times in case there was a version of those pages where the conclusion was different. There wasn't. Stage 2 arrived on day 5. The photographs, the ones that had supposedly shown Nia meeting with rival syndicate operatives in a Gangnam hotel, had been run through digital forensic analysis. The metadata had been scrubbed, which in itself was a flag. But the background architecture visible through the hotel window in 3 of the images had been cross-referenced against construction permit records, and the building visible in the photographs hadn't existed in that form until 7 months after the date the images were supposedly taken. Staged. Every one of them. And Serena had been the one who delivered the photographs to him, personally, in a private meeting she'd requested with tears in her eyes, telling him she was sorry. She'd discovered it by accident. She'd debated for weeks about whether to tell him. She couldn't in good conscience stay silent. He'd thanked her. He'd actually thanked her. Stage 3 hit on the evening of the 6th day. One of Park's people had pulled a communication chain from an archived internal server, the kind of archive that hadn't been reviewed in years because there was no reason to go looking. The encrypted message thread was between Serena and a digital address that took another 18 hours to trace, but when they traced it, it resolved to a proxy server that had been routed through 3 intermediary nodes, the last of which pointed back to a private residential communications device registered to a holding company that Min Jae recognized. He sat very still for a long time. The holding company belonged to his mother, Madame Kang. He drove to the family compound the next morning. His mother was in the East Garden when he arrived, which she always was at that hour, seated at the stone table beneath the persimmon trees, drinking the same tea she'd been drinking since Min Jae was old enough to remember mornings. 71 years old, silver-haired, wearing silk the color of charcoal, with the upright posture of someone who had decided somewhere in her 50s that the world owed her a certain quality of audience. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the garden path. "You're early," she said. "Breakfast isn't ready." "I didn't come for breakfast." She studied his face for a moment, the mother's instinct cutting through everything else, reading him the way she always had. And then she set her teacup down precisely on its saucer and folded her hands in her lap. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine standing." "Min Jae, the Laurent file." He stopped 3 feet from the table. "Tell me what you did." The garden was quiet. Somewhere behind the compound wall, a car passed on the street. The persimmon branches moved in a small wind. His mother did not look away from him. That was the thing he noted, even through everything else. She didn't flinch or deflect or perform confusion. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had always known this conversation was coming and had made her peace with it, and that steadiness somehow made everything worse. "I did what was necessary," she said. The words landed like something physical. "She wasn't right for you," Madame Kang continued, her voice carrying the same flat conviction she'd used to deliver every non-negotiable in his life. "She wasn't Korean. She didn't understand the structure of what we are. She would have pulled you into a different world, a different set of priorities. You destroyed her." His voice didn't rise. That was the part that scared him, that he was standing 3 feet from his mother in the morning light saying these words, and his voice was completely flat. "You built a conspiracy to destroy an innocent person. You used fabricated evidence to end her marriage, and you let me believe she betrayed me. I made a necessary decision. You let me think she—" He stopped, started again. "She was pregnant, did you know that?" A pause. Barely a pause, but enough. "No," his mother said. "Not at the time." "And now?" She didn't answer. "And now," he repeated. "I know about the child," Madame Kang said quietly. "I've known for some time." The garden felt like a place he'd never stood before, like the familiar geography had shifted 3 degrees while he was standing in it. "You knew she had my child," he said, "and you said nothing. What would you have had me say? That she existed?" The flatness cracked just slightly, just along one edge. "That I had a daughter. That Nia Laurent left this country alone and pregnant because of something you engineered." He turned his back on her for a moment, pressing the heel of his hand hard against the stone wall at the edge of the path, and then he turned back. "You took that from me. You took 4 years of my daughter's life from me. And you didn't say a word." His mother's composure held. It always held. That had always been the thing Min Jae admired about her, the absolute refusal to bend. And now, standing in this garden on this morning, he recognized it for the first time as the thing that had made her capable of doing what she'd done. "The syndicate required stability," she said. "Nia Laurent was a destabilizing element. I made a decision in the interest of—" "Don't." He stepped back. "Don't make it political. Don't give me the syndicate argument. You hated her because she didn't submit to you, because she looked at you and refused to be afraid. That's it. That's the whole truth of it." His mother was quiet. "Yes," she said finally, so quietly it barely cleared the morning air. "That is part of it." He stood there looking at her for a long time, at this woman who had built him from the ground up, who had shaped every hard thing in him, who had dragged the Kong family from mid-level regional operators to the apex of the Crimson Serpents through sheer ruthless intelligence and refusal to accept any outcome she hadn't decided on. And he understood, standing there, that she had taught him exactly how to become the kind of man who could believe a lie about someone he loved if the alternative meant examining his own certainty. She'd made him in her image, and he'd failed Nia with the tools his mother had given him. He left without saying anything else. Chab. He had Ji-wook locate Nia through the hotel guest registry. She was staying in a private penthouse suite at the Park Hyatt, booked under a corporate name he didn't recognize at first, but which traced, eventually, to a London-registered financial services holding company that turned out, when he finally looked it up properly, to be one of the top 10 private wealth management firms in Europe. She hadn't come back to Korea to survive. She'd come back because she was powerful enough that she didn't need to avoid it anymore. He thought about that for a long time. He called ahead. Not with a demand, not with a message delivered through intermediaries, but personally, from his own number, at 2 in the afternoon, 3 days after he left his mother's garden. The phone rang 4 times. When she picked up, she said nothing, just waited. "I know you're at the Park Hyatt," he said. "I want to talk." Another pause, long enough that he wondered if she was going to hang up. "7th floor lounge," she said. 5 o'clock. If you bring anyone with you, I leave. I'll come alone." She hung up. He arrived at 4:58. She was already there, seated at a corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Han River in the evening light. No aide, No security visible, no defensive posturing. Just Nia Laurent in a dark green top and pressed trousers, a glass of water on the table, a leather portfolio open in front of her that she closed and set aside when she saw him coming. He sat down across from her. A waiter appeared. Min-jae ordered coffee. He didn't intend to drink. The waiter left. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Nia looked at him the way she'd looked at him across the ballroom, with that measured, unsurprised steadiness. She'd looked at him that way during their very first meeting, too, years ago, when he'd tried to shut down her presentation with the kind of blunt dismissal that made grown men in suits apologize and sit back down. She'd done neither. She'd stood there and looked at him exactly like this and said, quietly and without heat, that she'd finished speaking and if he'd like to offer a substantive counter-argument, she would give it full consideration. He'd been furious. He'd also been unable to think about much else for the following week. "You looked into it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And?" "I know what happened." He kept his voice level. "I know who built it. I know how it was done." She nodded slowly, once. "I need to ask you something," he said. Her eyes didn't shift, waiting. "The child," he said. The word felt like it scraped on the way out. "Amani? Is she mine?" He watched her face. There was a version of this moment where she made him work for it, where she used the pause as punishment, as leverage, as the smallest portion of what he deserved after standing in front of 200 people 3 years ago and dismantling her life. He would have understood it. He wouldn't have blamed her. She didn't make him work for it. "Yes," she said. One word. The Han River glittered through the windows behind her. Somewhere in the lounge, a couple at another table laughed at something. The coffee arrived. Min-jae didn't touch it. "She's 4 years old," he said. 4 and 3 months. "I've missed—" "Yes." Her voice was perfectly even, not cruel, not soft, precise. "You have." He pressed his hands flat against the table. "I want to see her." "I know you do." "Nia, I'm not saying no." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just bridging distance enough to make sure there was no ambiguity in what she was about to say. "I'm saying that this is going to happen on my schedule, with my conditions. You don't get to arrive at the Park Hyatt 3 years late and restart the clock from zero as if those years were just a logistical delay." She held his gaze. "You destroyed my reputation in front of the entire country. You divorced me while I was carrying your child. You didn't investigate. You chose your pride over the truth, and you didn't fight for me for a single hour." Every word was accurate, every single one. "I know," he said. "Don't apologize yet," she said. "I'm not interested in apologies right now. I want you to understand that I'm not here because I forgave you. I'm here because Amani is old enough to start asking questions about her father, and I refuse to let her grow up with a story that isn't honest." She picked up her water glass, held it for a moment without drinking. "She knows your name. I didn't hide that from her. I told her the truth in words she could understand, that her father and I weren't together, that it was complicated, that I would tell her more when she was older." "What does she know about me?" "That you exist." A pause. "And that you have her eyes." Something in his chest moved. He looked out the window for a moment. The sky over the Han was going bronze at the edges, the kind of evening light that made everything look briefly more significant than it was. "I want to fix this," he said. "You can't fix it," she said immediately, flatly. "It happened. It's done. You can only build something different going forward, and that's a slower process than you're probably comfortable with." He looked back at her. "You're going to make me prove it." "Yes," she said simply. "I am." She closed her hands around her water glass. "And here's what I need you to understand, Min-jae. Before any of this goes further, being Amani's father does not earn you anything with me. It does not mean we're reconciling. It does not mean the past is behind us. She gets to have a relationship with you because she deserves that, not because it repairs what you broke." She looked at him steadily. "Are we clear on that?" He held her gaze for a long time. "Yes," he said. She nodded, picked up her phone, set it back down, then said, almost as an aside, almost casually in the way that meant it was actually the most important thing, "She's been asking about the city. She's never been to Seoul before. I brought her here to see it." Because you knew I'd be at the gala. She didn't deny it. I've been back in Korea for 6 months, she said. I've been watching. I wanted to know who you were now before I decided whether it was safe to let her near you. The fact that she'd done that, approached it with that kind of deliberate protective intelligence, hit him harder than anything else she'd said. She'd built a methodology around keeping their daughter safe from him if necessary. She'd given herself information before she gave him access. He'd spent 4 years building the most sophisticated intelligence network in the country. She'd outmaneuvered him with patience and love for a child he hadn't known existed. "When can I meet her?" he asked. Nia looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward him. A photograph. A little girl with Min-jae's eyes and Nia's cheekbones standing in what looked like a London park, wearing a yellow raincoat and holding a too large umbrella with both hands and laughing at something off camera with her whole face. He didn't realize his hand had moved until he felt his fingertip touch the corner of the phone screen. "Tomorrow morning," Nia said. 9 o'clock. You come here. No cars parked outside, no security in the building. You come as a person, not as the head of the Crimson Serpents. She took the phone back. "And if you make her cry for any reason, I will pull her out of this country so fast you'll find out about it from a lawyer." "Understood," he said. She stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up her portfolio. "Min-jae," she said. He looked up. "I know you had your investigators tear the file apart." Her voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more direct, more stripped. "I know what they found. I know you went to see your mother." She tilted her head slightly. "I need you to understand something about that. I didn't need you to investigate. I didn't need the evidence confirmed. I've known the truth since the day I left." She paused. "What I needed, 3 years ago, was for you to choose differently before the evidence was ever necessary. You didn't." She walked away. He sat at the table for a long time after she left, his untouched coffee going cold in front of him, the Han River bronze, and then amber, and then dark through the windows as the evening finished happening. He had been wrong in a way that investigations couldn't fix. He had been wrong in a way that the correct target of his rage couldn't fix. He had been wrong in a way that only time and consistency and sustained humility might only begin, to address. And in a hotel suite 7 floors above the city, a little girl with his eyes was asleep in a lavender-painted room, dreaming about something he'd never know, with no idea that her father was sitting downstairs for the first time in her life, trying to figure out how to deserve the chance to know her. He finally stood up, left the coffee, walked out into the Seoul night, and for the first time in years, Kang Min-jae, feared head of the Crimson Serpents, the most dangerous man in the city, felt the specific weight of being exactly what he was. A man who had been given everything and thrown away the only thing that mattered. The question that walked home with him through the cold streets wasn't whether he could fix what he'd broken. It was whether he was truly capable of becoming something different than what had broken it. And somewhere across the city, in a glass office building that none of his intelligence reports had flagged, a phone lit up with a text message on a private number, and the woman who received it read it once, set the phone face down on the desk, and smiled slowly in the dark, because Kang Min-jae was exactly where she'd calculated he would be. And she hadn't even begun to move yet. The morning came in gray. Seoul in November wore its cold like a warning. Not bitter yet, not the kind of cold that gets into the bones and stays, but sharp enough at the edges that you felt it every time you stepped outside and remembered that the comfortable version of things was ending. Min-jae stood at the window of his private study at 6:43 in the morning in a white dress shirt with the top 2 buttons open and yesterday's sleeve creases still in the fabric, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading the same paragraph of Park's intelligence summary for the 4th time without absorbing it. He'd slept maybe 3 hours. The study was the one room in the Kang estate that belonged entirely to him. No family portraits, no display cases full of Syndicate-era artifacts, no visual reminders of the structure he'd been born into and built higher and bled for. Just shelves of books he actually read, a desk that was actually used, and a single framed photograph on the far wall that Nia had taken 7 years ago in Jeju, before everything, when they were still in the phase where everything felt like it was possible and none of the damage had been done yet. He'd never taken it down. He'd asked himself why, more than once in the years since. The honest answer was that taking it down would have required making a decision about what the photograph meant, and he hadn't been willing to make that decision in either direction. He looked at it now from across the room. She was laughing in the photograph, turned slightly toward the water, hair moving in the coastal wind, caught mid-sentence by whoever was holding the camera, completely unaware of being watched. It was the best photograph anyone had ever taken of her, and she'd never seen it because it had been on a camera that one of his aides had been using, and he'd had it printed quietly without telling her. He used to think that was romantic. He now understood it as the first small version of the same problem, the watching without permission, the cataloging of her without asking. The assumption that because he wanted something, it was his. He put the coffee cup down, checked his watch, 3 hours and 14 minutes until 9 o'clock. Bukit. He arrived at the Park Hyatt at 8:52. One car, no escort, no detail waiting in the lobby. He'd told Ji-wook to stay at the estate, and Ji-wook had argued exactly once before reading Min-jae's expression and stopping. He wore dark trousers and a charcoal wool sweater, deliberately not a suit because showing up in a suit to meet his 4-year-old daughter for the first time felt like the wrong kind of armor. He took the elevator to the 7th floor, walked to the suite number Nia had texted him the previous night, stood outside the door for a moment. Then he knocked. Footsteps from inside. Not Nia's. Lighter, quicker, uneven in the way of someone small moving fast. He heard a voice, Nia's, low, saying something he couldn't make out through the door. And then the footsteps slowed, and there was a pause, and then the door opened. Nia was holding the door, one hand on the frame. Behind her, partially visible, a small face peered around her hip. Amani. In daylight, the resemblance hit him differently than it had across a ballroom. Up close, it was both more and less than he'd expected. More, because the specific architecture of those eyes was undeniable in a way that ballroom distance had softened, and less because she was also so completely her own person. She had Nia's nose and the particular way Nia held her chin slightly up when she was uncertain about something. She was wearing blue pajama pants and a yellow sweatshirt with a cartoon bear on it, and she was holding a small stuffed elephant by its back leg and watching him with the focused, unafraid scrutiny of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was considered rude. "Hi," he said, which was, he was aware, the least impressive opening statement he'd produced in his adult life. Amani did not say anything. She continued studying him. "Amani," Nia said calmly, stepping back from the door to let him in. "This is Min-jae. Remember what I told you?" "He has my eyes," Amani said. Her English was precise and slightly formal in the way of a child who'd learned language carefully from someone who cared about words. "He does," Nia said. Min-jae stepped inside the suite. It was warm, lived in the way that Nia always made spaces feel within 48 hours of arriving somewhere. A soft blanket folded over the armrest of the couch, a child's drawing spread across the coffee table, 2 books stacked on the console by the window. It smelled like the specific combination of coffee and whatever shampoo Nia had used for as long as he'd known her, and something sweet he couldn't immediately identify that was probably coming from a small ceramic diffuser on the kitchen counter. He stood in the entryway feeling enormous and unnecessary. Amani walked to the couch, climbed up onto it with the careful, deliberate movements of someone too short for the furniture, settled herself, and then looked at him again. "Can you sit down?" she said. "You're too tall standing up." Nia made a sound that was almost a laugh and covered it with the back of her hand. Min-jae sat down in the chair across from the couch. He was, at that moment, sitting across from the most effective interrogator he'd encountered in 4 decades of life, and she was 4 years old and holding a stuffed elephant. "What's his name?" he asked, nodding at the elephant. Amani looked at the elephant, then back at him. Her name is Peanut." "Peanut," he repeated. Good name. I named her when I was 2, Amani said, with the tone of someone who understood that younger decisions should be given appropriate historical context. "I would choose differently now." "What would you choose now?" She thought about it seriously for a moment. "Constance," she said, "because she's always there." Min-jae looked up and found Nia watching him from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and an expression he couldn't fully read, careful, guarded, but not closed. She turned and went back to making coffee. He turned back to Amani. Constance is a better name, he said honestly. The little girl seemed to accept this. She pulled her feet up onto the couch cushion and leaned sideways against the armrest, studying him with those unsettling, familiar eyes. Mama said you live in Seoul, she said. I do. We live in London. I know. Do you like Seoul? He thought about it. The honest answer was complicated in ways she didn't need. It's home, he said. I don't always like it, but it's mine. Amani seemed to find this reasonable. She nodded slowly, the way children nod when they're filing something into a category. Then, why didn't you come before? The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. From the kitchen, the sounds of coffee preparation went quiet. Min-jae held Amani's gaze. He thought about the 12 different, careful, age-appropriate, emotionally responsible ways to answer that question. Then he thought about the fact that this child had Nia's intelligence underneath those Kang eyes, and that whatever he said right now was going to be the foundation of every conversation they had after this, and that starting with a managed version of the truth was starting wrong. I made mistakes, he said. Big ones. I didn't know about you, and that was my fault, not your mother's. When I found out, I came as fast as I could. Amani was quiet for a moment. Did you say sorry to Mama? Not yet. Not properly. Another nod. Slower this time. Then she uncurled from the couch armrest, slid down to the floor with the careful logistics of someone navigating furniture one size too big, walked across to him, and held out Peanut who should be Constance. He looked at the stuffed elephant, then at Amani. You can hold her, she said. She helps when things are hard. He took the elephant, held it in both hands. Something happened in his chest that he wasn't going to examine while he was sitting in this room. Thank you, he said. Amani patted his knee twice with a flat palm, the way a small adult might comfort someone, and then went back to the couch. Nia came in from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs. She set one on the table near his chair without a word, took the couch beside Amani, and the 3 of them sat in the strange, warm quiet of the suite for a while. The city outside gray and moving, the elephant in Min-jae's hands weighing approximately nothing and everything at the same time. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th day, Amani asked him if he knew any Korean songs. He knew several, but couldn't think of any appropriate for a 4-year-old in the first 30 seconds. So he said the first one that came into his head, which was a drinking song he'd learned from an older syndicate member 20 years ago. He started it and stopped himself 2 lines in and said, never mind. Amani asked why not. He said it was a song for grown-ups. She accepted this, but made him promise to find a different one. So that evening, he searched for children's songs on his phone for the first time in his life and came back the next day with 2 that he'd practiced enough to get through without losing the melody entirely. He sang them badly. She corrected his pronunciation on 3 syllables and his rhythm on 2 more with the merciless precision of someone with perfect pitch. He came back anyway. On the 7th day, Nia let him take Amani to the small park behind the hotel for an hour. He stood in the cold morning air watching her climb a slide structure with total focus and no fear, and something so unfamiliar moved through him that he spent most of the hour simply trying to identify it. It wasn't pride. Not the kind he knew, anyway. The pride he knew was comparative. This was just pure, clean, uncomplicated wonder. He texted Ji-wook from the park bench, reschedule the Busan meeting, push it 2 weeks. Ji-wook texted back, the chairman isn't going to be happy. Min-jae looked up at Amani reaching the top of the slide. That's his problem, he wrote back. She came down laughing and ran straight to him without slowing, hit his legs with both hands, and looked up at him with those shared eyes. Again, she said. He stood up. Again, he agreed. Night. He didn't see Nia alone again until the 9th day. Amani had been picked up by the hotel aide for her afternoon nap, and for the first time since the penthouse visit started, it was just the 2 of them in the suite. The comfortable scaffolding of a 4-year-old's schedule and needs had been holding the space between them in a useful shape, and without it the room immediately felt different. Bigger, more honest. Nia was at the window with her coffee, looking out at the Han. She'd changed from her morning clothes into a dark blazer over a gray top, which meant she had calls or meetings later. He'd always been able to read her schedule from what she wore, Not because she was predictable, but because she was consistent in specific ways that required attention to learn. She started calling you Minji instead of the man, Nia said, without turning from the window. I noticed. That's her version of approval. She's careful with names. He sat down on the arm of the couch. She told me yesterday that Peanut is now officially named Constance. She made it formal. She announced it at dinner. Nia turned from the window. Her expression was in that middle register she held around him now. Not hostile, not open, just present and watchful. You're good with her. I don't know what I'm doing. She doesn't need you to know what you're doing. She needs you to show up. She paused. You've shown up every day. That matters to her. Does it matter to you? The question was out before he could decide whether to ask it. She held his gaze and he held hers, and the honest answer sat between them in the room without either of them reaching for it yet. Ask me something easier, she said. He nodded. Let it go. For now. Serena Vale, he said. Nia's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted. A slight tightening at the corners of her eyes. A stillness that came from the decision to not react physically to the name. What about her? Park's team has been watching her movement since I reopened the file. She knows the investigation exists. She has sources inside the organization, which is its own problem I'm dealing with separately. He rested his forearms on his thighs. She's been active. 3 meetings in the past 2 weeks with people I don't like. One of them is a Gangnam media consultant who specializes in narrative management. Meaning she's preparing a story. Nia set her coffee down on the windowsill. She looked at him with something in her face that was harder to read now. Not fear, nothing close to fear, but a kind of weary recognition. What kind of story? I don't know yet. Park is working on it. He met her eyes. I wanted you to know before it moved. Whatever she releases, I want you to have time to... I don't need protection from a media campaign, Nia said flatly. I've survived worse. I know that. Then why are you telling me? Because she's not just coming for me this time. He let the weight of it sit plainly in the sentence without loading it with anything extra. She's watched me spend 9 days in this hotel. She knows about Amani. The room changed. Not dramatically. Nia didn't move. Her posture didn't shift. Her expression stayed in that controlled register. But something underneath it altered, the way pressure alters underwater without disturbing the surface, and Min-jae felt it from across the room. How does she know about Amani? Nia's voice was careful now, precise. I don't know. Either the hotel has a leak or she had me followed, which means she had someone stationed outside, which means she started planning before the gala. Nia turned back to the window briefly, a short movement that he recognized as the physical processing of information she'd rather not have. Then she turned back. She knew we'd encounter each other. Yes. And she positioned herself before that happened. Yes. Nia looked at him. Your intelligence network didn't catch that. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't designed to wound him. She said it the same way she'd say something was structurally unsound, simply noting the reality. But it landed anyway. No, he said. It didn't. She walked to the coffee table and picked up her phone. Looked at the screen briefly. Set it back down. When she looked at him again, the careful middle register was still there, but something sharper had moved into it. The sharpness of someone who has been threatened in the place they are least willing to be threatened. If she goes after Amani publicly, Nia said, she won't survive it. He said it quietly and without performance, the same tone he used for factual statements. I will personally ensure that. I don't need her destroyed, Nia said. I need my daughter protected. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I need to make some calls. Can you come back tonight for Amani's bedtime? She's been asking if you can. The shift, from Serena to Amani, from threat management back to their daughter's bedtime, was so deliberate and so Nia that it almost made him smile despite everything. 7 o'clock, he said. 7, she confirmed, and turned back to the window. He left. He was in the car 20 minutes from the hotel when Park called. She moved faster than we anticipated, Park said, without greeting. The media consultant filed a preliminary package 2 hours ago to 4 separate outlets. We intercepted the brief through our contact at one of them. Min-jae looked out the car window. What's the angle? Park paused. The pause of someone about to say something they don't want to say. She's not going after you directly. The package is positioned as a public interest story about an unnamed crime boss manipulating a foreign national and her child to gain leverage in an upcoming criminal investigation into the Crimson Serpents. The car was very quiet. She's framing it as Nia being used, Min-jae said. She's framing it as the child being used, as leverage, as cover. Another pause. She's specifically suggesting that Nia is aware of it and complicit, that she came back to Korea as part of an arrangement. The specific coldness of it was almost elegant. Serena had built a story that was designed to destroy both of them. Nia's credibility, Min-jae's legitimate case against her, while simultaneously making Amani the centerpiece of a public narrative neither parent had agreed to. How long until publication? He asked. If we can't intercept all 4 outlets, 72 hours, maybe less. Get me names of every person who signed off on that package. Sir. Names, Park. Yes, sir. He hung up, pressed his hand flat against the cold window glass. 72 hours. And somewhere in an office across the city, Serena Vale was watching the clock with the calm of a woman who believed she had already won, completely unaware that in the suite of the Park Hyatt Hotel, a small girl named Amani was waking from her afternoon nap, asking for the man with her eyes. And that the man with her eyes had just decided that the careful, measured approach he'd been committed to for the past 9 days had reached the precise moment where it was no longer enough. He told the driver to turn around. Not back to the hotel. Not yet. He needed 20 minutes first. 20 minutes to think without anyone watching his face while he thought, because the thing currently happening behind his eyes was not something he was ready to perform his way through in front of Nia Laurent, who read him better than anyone alive and would see immediately that the calculation had shifted. Drive, he said. Han River, South Bank. The driver didn't ask questions. They pulled along the riverside embankment and Min-jae got out and walked. The cold came in off the water immediately, cutting through the wool sweater, sharp enough to make his eyes water if he faced into the wind. He faced into it anyway. The Han was steel gray and moving in the late afternoon light, the kind of flat industrial beauty Seoul wore so naturally that most people stopped seeing it. He'd grown up near this river. He'd made his first real decision at 17 on a bridge 2 kilometers east, a decision that had set the trajectory of everything that came after, a decision he'd been told by an older man in the organization was necessary and unavoidable, and which he now understood had been neither. He'd been making necessary and unavoidable decisions ever since. He stopped walking and stood at the railing. 72 hours. Serena had built this carefully. That was the thing he kept returning to. Not the content of the attack, not the particular viciousness of using Amani as the narrative centerpiece, but the architecture of it, the timing. She'd let him spend 9 days establishing a visible pattern at the hotel before she moved. She'd waited until there was enough public record of his presence to make the manipulation story plausible. She'd used his own legitimate effort to be a father as the raw material for the lie. That required patience. That required someone who understood how he thought well enough to predict that he would show up daily, consistently, and create exactly the evidentiary footprint she needed. Which meant Serena Vale had not panicked and improvised this. She'd planned it from before the gala, which meant the gala appearance had been part of her calculation too. He took his phone out, called Park. The gala, he said when Park picked up. Pull the invitation list for Nia Laurent's table. I want to know who extended that invitation. A pause, keys in the background. That's going to take a few hours. You have 2. Call me. He hung up, stared at the river for another minute. Then he called Ji-wook. I need the Serena Vale complete file, he said. Everything we have. Her financials, her current operational contacts, her history with the organization going back to the beginning. Physical copies on my desk by the time I get back to the estate. Sir, that's a significant pull. Some of those files are archived off-site. Then start now. He ended the call, stood at the railing a moment longer. Then he texted Nia. Something came up on my end. I'll still be there at 7. Don't let her wait up past 8 if I'm late. The response came back in 4 minutes. She'll be up. She's been drawing something for you all afternoon. He put the phone in his pocket, walked back to the car. Ut. The estate felt different when he returned to it. He noticed it the moment he walked through the main entrance. A quality of stillness that wasn't emptiness, more like the particular quiet of a house where people have been careful about sound. Two of the household staff he usually passed in the corridor near the study were not in their usual positions. The East Wing sitting room, which he could see partially through the open doorway, had its curtains drawn, which was unusual before dark. He stopped in the main hallway. Ji-wook appeared from the direction of the study, moving quickly, and the expression on his face was a version Minji had seen before. The expression of someone who has information they don't want to have and have been waiting to give it to someone who can make it someone else's problem. "She's here," Ji-wook said. Minjae didn't need to ask who. "How long?" "About 40 minutes. She called ahead to Mrs. Park and household. I didn't know until she was already inside." A pause. "I'm sorry, sir. She came through the family entrance." The family entrance. The one his mother had a permanent code for, which had never been changed because changing it would have been a declaration he'd never been willing to make directly. He handed Ji-wook his coat without looking at him. "Where?" "East drawing room." He walked. Madame Kang was seated on the high-backed chair near the window, the one she'd always chosen when she wanted the room to work for her, the one that put her facing the door so that whoever entered had to approach while she watched. 71 years old in charcoal silk, her silver hair precisely set, hands folded in her lap. She looked like she'd been sitting there for a week. She looked like she'd never been rattled by anything. The room smelled faintly of her specific tea. Someone had brought it to her. He was going to find out who and have a direct conversation about who this house belonged to. He didn't sit down. He stood 6 feet from her chair and looked at her. "You came here," he said, "to my house. I need to speak with you about... You came to my house after what I said in the garden." Min Jae. His name, in her voice, with that particular pressure on the first syllable that she'd been using since he was a child to indicate she was not interested in preamble. "I am your mother. I understand you are angry. I need you to listen to me before you do something that cannot be undone. You're going to have to be significantly more specific about which irreversible action you mean, because I have several in progress." Something shifted in her face. Not quite alarm. Something more controlled than alarm, but in the vicinity. "Serena," she said. "Yes. I know what she's planning." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you?" "I've known for approximately a week." She held his gaze steadily. "I want you to understand that I did not sanction this. What she is doing now is outside anything I agreed to or intended." The temperature in the room, already cold, dropped another degree. "Let me make sure I understand you," Min Jae said. He walked to the chair across from her and sat down, not to be comfortable, but because standing was a posture for someone still deciding, and he had just decided. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. "You knew Serena was preparing a media attack on Nia and my daughter, and you said nothing to me, and you're now sitting in my drawing room telling me you didn't sanction it. I'm telling you it escalated beyond... How long have you been in contact with her?" The pause was very small. "We have maintained a limited communication since... Since when?" "Since before the gala." He sat very still. "You knew she was planning something at the gala," he said. "I knew she was aware that Nia Laurent had returned to Korea. I knew she was monitoring the situation. I told her to be careful. I told her not to... You told her to be careful." He repeated the words back to her in a flat tone that had nothing in it. "You knew she was moving against Nia Laurent, and you told her to be careful, and you said nothing to me. I was trying to manage." "You were protecting her." He leaned forward slightly. "Because whatever she does to Nia keeps Nia away from me. That's still the objective, isn't it? 3 years later, with a grandchild you've apparently known about and never acknowledged, the objective is still the same." Madame Kang's composure held. It always held. But there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there in the garden, something that might, in a different person, have looked like the beginning of understanding. "The child changes things," she said, and her voice had shifted slightly, flattened out of the authoritative register into something less constructed. "I understand that. I have been reconsidering." "You have been reconsidering," he said slowly. My daughter is 4 years old, and you have been reconsidering for an unspecified amount of time while staying in contact with the woman who is currently preparing to put her face in front of every news outlet in the country as the child of a criminal manipulation scheme. He stood up, not with heat, without it, which was worse. Get out of my house. Min-jae, I will deal with Serena. I will deal with the media package. I will deal with every consequence of what the two of you built 3 years ago. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. But I will not have you in this house while I do it, and I will not have you anywhere near Amani, not until I decide whether that is ever something I'm willing to allow. He looked back at her. Go. She looked at him for a long moment across the drawing room. Her face was composed, but her hands, he noticed, were no longer folded neatly in her lap. They were pressed flat against her thighs. She stood, straightened her jacket, walked past him through the door without touching him, without looking at him, with the rigid dignity of someone who had decided that whatever she was feeling was not going to be visible in this corridor on this evening. He listened to her footsteps recede toward the family entrance. He heard the door close. He stood in the doorway of the empty drawing room and breathed. Tick, Park called at 6:40. Gala invitation, Park said. Nia Laurent's table. The invitation was extended through a third-party hospitality coordinator, routed back through 2 holding companies. The originating account, a pause. Sir, the originating account traces to a communications address that our forensics team flagged in the original investigation sweep last week. Minji already knew what Park was going to say. He said it anyway, because he needed to hear it out loud. Serena's proxy server. Yes, sir. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She arranged for Nia to be at the gala. The invitation was issued 6 weeks ago, before the gala, before any public indication that you'd be conducting an investigation. Park's voice was careful in the way of someone delivering information they understand the weight of. She wanted them in the same room. She needed you to see the child. The architecture of it opened up completely in his mind. Every piece in sequence, each one load-bearing. Serena had known about Amani, had likely known for longer than any of them. She'd calculated that if Min-jae saw his daughter, he'd reopen the investigation. She'd let him reopen it. She'd let him discover the truth about the fabricated evidence. She'd let him begin the process of building a relationship with Nia and Amani. 9 days of visible daily visits that she'd been watching with her source inside the organization, feeding her the movements in real time. And now, with the investigation ongoing and Min-jae's credibility as a witness against her at its highest potential value, she was going to detonate the media package and reframe the entire narrative. Not to destroy Nia, not primarily. To destroy Min-jae's case against her by making him look like the predator. She needed him discredited before federal investigators could move on the evidence from the original conspiracy. She needed him to appear publicly as a criminal exploiting a foreign woman and her child, so that any testimony or evidence he brought forward would be contaminated by the story that came first. Serena Vale wasn't attacking Nia. She was using Nia to neutralize Min-jae. And she'd orchestrated the entire sequence, from Nia's gala invitation to his 9 days of hotel visits to the media package timing, with a patience and precision that suggested she'd been planning this particular response the moment she understood that her original conspiracy might one day be investigated. How long has she known about Amani? He asked. We're still tracing that, Park said, but based on communication timestamp analysis, minimum 2 years. 2 years. He set the phone against his thigh for a moment. 2 years she'd known he had a daughter in London, and she'd held that information as a weapon and waited for precisely the right moment to use it. Pull everything we have that connects her to the federal investigation timeline, he said, putting the phone back to his ear. If she's moving to discredit me as a witness, it's because she knows the federal case is closer than she's comfortable with. I want to know who her contact is inside the prosecutor's office. Sir, if she has a contact inside, find it, Park, all of it, tonight. He hung up, checked his watch. 6:51. 9 minutes. He was not going to be late. Yee. Amani answered the door before Nia could get there, which Min-jae surmised meant she'd been watching from the entryway since approximately 10 minutes before he was due, because she was in pajamas already, but had her shoes on over the pajama feet with the Velcro tabs done up on the wrong sides, which had the specific quality of someone who had dressed for the possibility of action on short notice. She looked up at him. "You're 3 minutes late," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment with those eyes. "You look like something is wrong." He crouched down to her level. "Everything's okay," he said. Not entirely true, but not a lie either. For this specific doorway, this specific 4-year-old, everything was okay. "What did you draw today?" She grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. The drawing was on the coffee table, which she presented by standing beside it and gesturing at it with both hands in the manner of someone revealing something significant. It was crayon on hotel stationery, a large piece. The composition showed 3 figures, a tall, dark figure on the left. In what appeared to be a black rectangle, he understood was a suit, a medium figure in the middle with hair going in several directions, which was clearly Nia, and a small figure between them holding one hand each. Above the 3 figures, she'd drawn yellow circles, which he initially thought were a decorative element, until he noticed they were connected to thin brown lines. "Lanterns?" he said. "Mama told me about the Lantern Festival," Amani said, pointing at the yellow circles. "She said you used to go when she lived here." She looked at him with the serious inquiry of a child establishing facts. "Will you take us?" He looked at the drawing, the 3 figures with their hands connected, the yellow lanterns strung above. He looked up at Naya, who was leaning against the kitchen doorway with her coffee and an expression he hadn't seen from her in this context before. Not the watchful middle register, not the careful guardedness, but something quieter and less defended than that. It lasted only a moment before she looked down at her mug. "We'll see," he said to Amani. "Maybe." She accepted this with a nod that indicated maybe was a workable opening position and she'd be returning to the subject. He read to her for 40 minutes while she fell asleep against his arm on the couch, Constance, the elephant, tucked under her chin. He sat very still during the last 10 minutes after she went under, not wanting to displace her, watching her breathe in the specific deep unconscious way of children who feel completely safe. And he thought about Serena Vale in an office somewhere with a timer running, and a media package primed and the careful machine of someone else's destruction already in motion. When he finally moved Amani to her bed, an operation he performed with the concentration of someone diffusing something fragile, and came back into the main room, Naya was at the dining table with her laptop open and 3 printed documents spread beside it. She looked up. "Tell me what happened," she said. Not the managed version, the actual version. He sat down across from her, and he told her everything, Park's findings, Serena's timeline, the gala invitation traced back to the proxy server, the federal investigation and Serena's likely inside contact, the fact that his mother had known for a week and said nothing. Nia listened without interrupting. She had a specific quality when she was processing difficult information. She went very still, not frozen, just utterly controlled, as if all the energy available to her was being redirected entirely to comprehension. He'd always found it equal parts impressive and slightly frightening. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then, "She's been watching Amani for 2 years. "Yes." "She knew about my daughter for 2 years and sat on it." "Yes." Nia closed her laptop. The sound was very quiet in the suite. She placed both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. And Min-jae watched the specific effort it took her to process that particular piece of information. Not the threat to herself, she'd cataloged that already and moved past it. But the reality that her child had been a known quantity in someone else's calculation for 2 years without her knowledge. "How do we stop the package?" she said. "We can block 2 of the 4 outlets, the other 2... He paused. "I can apply pressure, but applying that kind of pressure before the federal investigation closes is a risk. If it looks like I'm suppressing, then don't suppress it," Naya said. She looked up at him. "Let it run." He stared at her. "If you suppress it, you give her exactly the story she wants, a crime boss silencing the press to protect himself." Naya turned one of the printed documents toward her without looking at it. "If the story runs and you're already on record, publicly, verifiably, before it runs, then it changes the framing." She met his eyes. "You need to get ahead of it." "Get ahead of it," he repeated. "You need to tell the truth publicly before she tells her version of it." She held his gaze with the calm of someone who has thought this through faster than he has and is waiting for him to catch up. "All of it. The conspiracy, your mother, The original fabricated evidence, your own failures. A pause. On record, on camera, before those outlets publish. He understood what she was saying. To do what she was describing, he would have to dismantle 3 years of reconstructed credibility in the Seoul power structure in a single public statement. He would have to stand in front of cameras and confirm every damaging thing his enemies had ever suspected about the Crimson Serpent's internal corruption. He would have to expose his mother. He would have to expose himself. It would be the end of the version of Kang Min-jae that the city had spent 4 decades learning to navigate around. He sat with that for a long time. If I do that, he said slowly, the federal investigation will use it. Yes, she said. They will. It could bring down parts of the organization, real parts, not just peripheral. Yes, she said again steadily, without apology. It could. He looked at her. You've already decided I should do it. I've decided what I think is right, she said. I'm not deciding for you. She pulled the laptop slightly toward her. But I will tell you this. If that story runs and Amani's face is part of it, and it turns out you had the ability to prevent it through honest disclosure and chose organizational survival instead, we will be done. Completely. The evenness in her voice was not coldness. It was the specific precision of someone saying something they mean entirely. She is not leverage. She is not collateral. She is my daughter, and she doesn't get to be part of someone else's story because you need to protect infrastructure. The room was very quiet. From down the hall, the faint sound of Amani's breathing, steady and deep, completely unaware. He thought about a drawing on hotel stationery. 3 figures. Yellow lanterns, hands connected. He thought about what it had cost Nia to build what she'd built alone, in a different country, without help, while carrying the specific private grief of knowing the full truth of what had been done to her and never once making it anyone else's crisis. He thought about what he was, what he had always been, and whether those were the same thing. He picked up his phone, dialed. It rang twice before Park answered. Get me a press conference, Min-jae said. Tomorrow morning, full media access. The federal prosecutor's media liaison gets a courtesy call 20 minutes before it starts. He paused. And pull Ji-wook in. I need someone to draft a statement tonight. Park was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then, Sir, if you do a press conference tomorrow, the organization... I know what the organization will do, Min-jae said. Get me the conference. He ended the call, looked up at Nia. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet in these 9 days. Not the watchful middle register, not the careful assessment, not the quiet grief that occasionally surfaced when she thought he wasn't paying full attention. Something that was almost, cautiously, reluctantly, the beginning of something else. But before either of them could determine what that something was, Min-jae's phone lit up on the table between them, and the name on the screen stopped every calculation currently running in the room. It wasn't Park. It wasn't Ji-wook. It was a number he recognized from the federal prosecutor's office. A number he had never given to anyone. A number that should not have had any reason to contact him at 9:43 on a Tuesday night. And when he picked up and the voice on the other end said 3 sentences, the press conference he'd just scheduled became the least urgent thing, the room. The voice on the other end belonged to Deputy Prosecutor Han Soo-yeon, and she said 3 things in rapid succession with the flat urgency of someone who had been awake for 19 hours and had stopped packaging difficult information softly sometime around hour 14. First, a federal arrest warrant for Kang Min-jae had been filed 40 minutes ago by a competing prosecutor in the same office, using evidence submitted anonymously through a secure channel 2 hours prior. Second, the evidence package contained financial documentation, recorded audio, and a sworn affidavit connecting Min-jae directly to the original conspiracy against Nia Laurent. Not as a victim of it, but as an architect of it. Third, Han Soo-yeon had 45 minutes before she was legally obligated to stand down from the case entirely due to the conflict the warrant created, and she was using those 45 minutes to make this call because she believed the submitted evidence was manufactured and she needed him to tell her she was right. Min-jae stood up from the table. Nia watched his face change. She saw the exact moment the information registered. Not dramatically, not with any performance, just a specific quality of stillness that moved across his features like a door closing slowly on everything behind it. When does the warrant execute? he said into the phone. Sunrise. There's a 6-hour procedural window. After that, it's out of any individual's hands. Who filed it? Prosecutor Lim Dae-sung. He received the evidence package through the secure channel at 7:15 tonight. Who submitted the package? A pause. The submission was anonymous, but the document formatting, Han's voice dropped slightly, as if she was checking whether anyone could hear her. Min-jae, the formatting matches Serena Vale's legal team's internal templates. I've seen her filings for 3 years. This is her architecture. He processed this in approximately 4 seconds. Serena had the inside contact in the prosecutor's office. That contact was Lim Dae-sung. She hadn't been using him just for intelligence. She'd been positioning him for exactly this moment, waiting until Min-jae's investigation into her was far enough advanced that she needed a decisive countermove. The media package wasn't the weapon. It was the distraction. The warrant was the weapon. The affidavit, he said. What does it claim specifically? That you ordered the fabrication of evidence against Nia Laurent personally, that Serena Vale acted under your direct instruction, that the conspiracy was designed to remove Nia from your organization because she had discovered financial irregularities you needed buried. Another pause, harder this time. It names your mother as a witness who can corroborate the account. The room temperature didn't change. Min-jae's internal temperature did. His mother, who had been in contact with Serena for a week, who had known about the media package and said nothing, who had come to his house tonight. And he understood now, with the specific clarity of someone who has just seen the full shape of something they were only seeing the edges of before, not to warn him about Serena, to give Serena time. The visit to the estate tonight had been a delay tactic. 40 minutes of his mother in the drawing room had been 40 minutes of Serena's legal team submitting the evidence package to Lim Dae-sung while Min-jae was occupied. Han, he said. Yes. I need 4 hours. A silence on the line that had weight to it. Min-jae, I told you I have 45. I need 4 hours and I need you to trust me for 4 hours. Everything Serena submitted is fabricated. I have the forensic evidence to prove it. I have the original investigation materials, the digital forensics on the forged transfers, the metadata analysis on the photographs, and a communication chain connecting Serena directly to my mother that predates the conspiracy by 6 months. He kept his voice level and fast. Not heated, just clear and sequential. I can have Park transmit the complete package to your personal secure line within 90 minutes. If you look at it and you still believe Lim's warrant is legitimate, I will surrender myself at 6 a.m. without requiring anyone to come get me. Another silence. Longer. 90 minutes, Han said. My personal line. If I don't have the package by 11:15, I can't help you. She hung up. Min-jae lowered the phone. Nia was standing now, both hands on the back of her chair, watching him with an expression that had moved entirely out of the careful middle register. This was something rawer. Not fear, but the specific alertness of someone who understands that the situation has just changed categories. Tell me, she said. He told her, quickly, completely, without managing it. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, one hand on the glass. Outside, Seoul was alive in the way cities are alive at 10 o'clock. Streams of headlights on the bridges, high-rises in every direction burning with lit windows, all of it indifferent and continuous and completely unaware. She flipped your mother, Nia said. My mother was never fully on my side. Serena redirected her. The warrant claims you ordered it. The conspiracy, the fabrication, all of it. She turned from the window. If that holds, it won't hold. The evidence I have... Min-jae. Her voice cut across him, not harshly but with precision. If Serena has had 2 years to prepare this move, and your mother is the corroborating witness, she did not leave gaps in it. She is not sloppy. She walked back toward the table. Whatever you have, she's already anticipated it and built an answer for it. He looked at her. You think I can't beat it? Beat. I think you're planning to fight it on evidentiary grounds, and she built it to survive evidentiary challenges. She stopped across the table from him. She doesn't need the warrant to stick. She needs it to run long enough that the press conference you were going to give tomorrow morning becomes impossible. If you're under active federal warrant when you stand in front of those cameras, everything you say gets framed as self-serving. The story she wanted, the crime boss protecting himself, writes itself. Her eyes were steady on his. She's not trying to convict you, she's trying to shut you up. The accuracy of it landed in his sternum like something blunt. He called Park. I need the complete evidentiary package compiled and transmitted to Han Soo-yeon's personal line in 80 minutes. He was already moving toward the door for his jacket. Everything. Original files, forensic analyses, the communication chain, the metadata report, cover letter from our forensics lead summarizing the chain of evidence. Nothing informal, nothing that looks assembled in a hurry, even if it is assembled in a hurry. Understood? 80 minutes is 78 now. Move. He ended the call, turned back to Nia. She was watching him with that expression again, the one from earlier tonight that had been the beginning of something before the phone call interrupted it. It was still there, adapted now to the new shape of the room, tighter around the edges, but still there. Go, she said. Do what you have to do. Amani, I have her. Her voice was firm and immediate. She's asleep, and she's safe, and she will still be here when this is done. She picked up his jacket from the chair where he had draped it and held it out. Don't let her wake up tomorrow to a world where Serena Vale won. He took the jacket. Their hands were close on the fabric for a moment. Not touching, but close. He left. The drive to the estate took 18 minutes. He spent 14 of them on the phone with Park running through the evidence package sequence, making sure the forensics lead understood the stakes of the transmission, and confirming that the communication chain between Serena and Madame Kang had been properly authenticated and time-stamped against the original server archive. The last 4 minutes he spent thinking about his mother. He didn't let himself feel it fully. Not yet. There was a specific thing he'd learned in his 20s about how to compartmentalize during operational urgency. A cold, necessary skill that had always served him and which he had never been entirely comfortable possessing, and he used it now. His mother's choices went into a compartment. The compartment closed. Later he would open it and deal with everything inside. Not now. The estate was lit when he arrived. Ji-wook was in the study with 2 other members of the intelligence team, the desk covered in physical files and printed documents, 3 laptops open. They'd been working since his call from the Riverside embankment. Where are we? Min-jae said, dropping his jacket over the doorframe. Package is 60% compiled, Ji-wook said without looking up. Forensics lead is verifying the final metadata report. Communication chain is authenticated. We have a problem with the financial forensics section. The original analyst who ran the report isn't reachable tonight, and his secondary signatory is... Who else can certify it? Dr. Yoon at Seoul National. She's done forensic accounting consultation for us before, but it's 10:20 at night. Call her. Sir, it's... Call her, Ji-wook. Tell her what it's for. If she says no, I'll call her myself. Ji-wook picked up his phone. Min-jae moved to the desk, pulled the communication chain printout toward him, and went through it page by page with a pen, marking timestamps, cross-referencing against the dates in the federal warrant filing that Han had described. The chain was damning. 11 weeks of encrypted messages between Serena and a proxy that resolved to Madame Kang's device, beginning 6 weeks before the gala invitation was issued, continuing through the 9 days of hotel visits, ending 4 days ago. 4 days ago. 2 days before his mother had come to the estate. She'd come to the estate after the communication chain went dark, because Serena had told her to stop using the channel once the evidence package was ready to submit, once there was nothing left to coordinate, because after that point, any further communication between them could only be a liability. His mother had been cut loose when she was no longer useful. He set the pen down, stood very still for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. Ji-wook said from across the room, Dr. Yoon says yes, she needs 40 minutes. Tell her 30, Min-jae said, and send a car. The package transmitted to Han Soo-yeon's secure line at 11:12. 3 minutes to spare. Min-jae sat in the study while Ji-wook confirmed the transmission and the other 2 intelligence team members started the secondary process of preparing copies for the Federal Oversight Board and the Independent Judiciary Review Panel. Because whatever Han did with the next 4 hours, he needed the evidence in front of bodies that Serena and Lim Dae-sung couldn't reach with a single phone call. Han called back at 11:41. I've reviewed the primary documents, she said. The exhaustion in her voice had sharpened into something harder. The communication chain alone is enough to challenge the warrant's evidentiary basis. The metadata analysis on the photographs is thorough. The financial forensics? A pause. Dr. Yoon's certification is solid. This is good work. Can you stop the warrant execution? I can file an emergency challenge at 4 a.m. when the judicial duty officer comes on. It'll pause execution pending review. Another pause. But Min Jae, if this goes to full review, everything in this package becomes part of the record. Your mother's involvement, the original conspiracy, all of it. I know. You understand what that means for... I know what it means, he said. File the challenge. A silence. Then, the press conference. Tomorrow morning. Are you still... Yes. Han was quiet for a moment, in a way that meant she was making a decision that went beyond her professional calculation. Lim is going to fight the challenge. He has Serena's resources behind him, and he's going to make it loud. Let him make it loud, Min Jae said. I want it loud. He was back in the car by midnight. He didn't go home. He drove through Seoul for 40 minutes. Just drove, no destination, the city moving past the windows in its nighttime version. Quieter, but not quiet. Never entirely quiet. Always some current of activity running beneath the surface. He thought about the press conference. He thought about standing in front of cameras and saying what needed to be said. And he thought about what it would feel like to do that. Not the aftermath, not the strategic implications, but the physical experience of being the man who said those words publicly, of being known completely, of having the controlled, managed, carefully constructed surface of Kang Min Jae dissolved by the simple act of honest public accounting. He'd built 30 years on the premise that the surface was the survival mechanism, that the feared, composed, impenetrable version of himself was what kept everyone he cared about safe. Because if people understood your vulnerabilities, they used them. Nia had been his vulnerability. Amani was his vulnerability now. And the lesson that Serena's entire architecture had been trying to teach him, the lesson that kept presenting itself in different forms, was that protecting vulnerabilities through concealment was just a slower version of losing them. The car stopped at a red light somewhere near the Cheonggyecheon stream. Min Jae looked out the window at the water running through the channel below the street. The old stream that the city had buried underground for 30 years and then dug back up and restored, because eventually someone had decided the cost of the concealment was higher than the risk of the exposure. He told the driver to take him back to the Park Hyatt. It was 12:40 when he arrived. He didn't call ahead. He went up to the 7th floor and knocked quietly, not with the expectation that she'd be awake just because he needed to be near the door for a minute. She opened it in 40 seconds. She was in a dark sweatshirt, hair down, a mug in her hand, which meant she'd been awake the whole time. She looked at his face and stepped back from the door without a word. He came inside, sat on the couch where he'd read to Amani 2 hours ago. The drawing was still on the coffee table. 3 figures, yellow lanterns, hands connected. Nia sat in the chair across from him. Han is filing the emergency challenge at 4, he said. The press conference is still happening. I have Ji-wook working on the statement. He rested his elbows on his knees. His hands were not entirely steady, not visibly, but he could feel it. The specific vibration of sustained adrenaline working through a body that hadn't slept properly in 48 hours. Serena's going to fight the challenge hard. Tomorrow morning is going to be ugly regardless of how it goes. Nia nodded slowly. But it's happening. Yes. She held her mug in both hands, looked at him for a moment with an expression he was starting to be able to read. The specific expression she wore when she was deciding how much of herself to offer into a space that she didn't yet fully trust. When you stand up there tomorrow, she said, and you say everything, she paused. There's going to be a version of this where the people in your organization decide you're a liability, where the power structure you've spent 30 years building turns on you because you've made it impossible for them to deny what it is. Yes. You could lose most of it. Yes. And you're still... Naya. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Not angry, just stripped. I sat in a garden with my daughter tonight while she fell asleep against my arm. I watched her breathe. He looked at the drawing on the coffee table. I have been the most feared man in this city for 15 years, and none of it, is worth one morning of her looking at the news and finding her face used as part of someone else's lie. He looked up. There's nothing left to calculate here. The suite was very quiet. Outside, Seoul continued. Nia set her mug down on the table next to the drawing. She looked at it for a moment. The three figures, the lanterns, the connected hands. And when she looked back at him, her face had shifted into something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Not the careful watchfulness, not the guarded assessment, not the measured distance she'd maintained with absolute discipline and entirely justified reason. Something unguarded. Something that looked, just briefly, like the woman in a photograph on a wall in the Kang estate, turned toward the sea, laughing at something she hadn't known was being captured. She started to say something. His phone went off. Not a call. An alert. The specific alert tone he'd assigned to Park for emergency-level developments. The one that had never sounded at 12:45 in the morning without meaning something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't wait. He looked at the screen. The message from Park was 4 words and a location address. She has the child. His blood didn't run cold. It stopped. He read the message again. Then he was standing, jacket in hand, and Nia was already on her feet across the room because she'd seen his face, and she already knew before he said it that the 4 words on his screen were the worst possible configuration of a situation that had spent 24 hours building toward exactly this. Nia didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed his arm, and said 1 word. Where? He showed her the screen. She read the message. Her face went through something he couldn't fully name. Not panic, because panic is a loss of control, and Nia Laurent had never in her life lost control of her face in a crisis. But something underneath the control shifted violently, the way deep water shifts during a quake when the surface is still. Her jaw tightened. Her grip on his arm tightened. She was asleep, Nia said. Her voice was absolutely level and absolutely lethal. She was in the next room. I know. How did someone... The aide. He was already texting Park back. It had to be the aide. Someone turned her. He looked up. Pack nothing. Come with me now. She was already moving. Park's full message came through in the elevator. 20 minutes ago, the hotel aide, a woman named Cho Yeon-ji, who had been with Nia for 8 months and whose background check Min Jae's team now understood had been deliberately sanitized, had taken Amani from her bed while Nia was in the main room. The security camera on the 7th floor showed the aide carrying Amani still asleep, wrapped in the hotel blanket, through the service exit at 12:19 a.m. A car had been waiting in the service alley. The car was registered to a shell company. The shell company traced to Serena Vale's legal team. Park had the service alley camera footage, a partial plate, and a direction of travel, north toward the Han River residential district. He had 2 Crimson Serpents vehicles already mobile. He was waiting for Min Jae's instruction before moving further because moving further required a decision about how this was going to be handled. Min Jae read the message as the elevator doors opened and he and Nia crossed the lobby. He understood the subtext of Park's restraint. The decision about how this was handled meant the decision about whether this stayed inside the organization's methods or whether it became something else. Whether Serena Vale encountered a consequence of the private variety or the kind that left a record. He thought about a 4-year-old girl wrapped in a hotel blanket, asleep, being carried through a service exit by someone she trusted. He thought about Nia beside him, walking with that rigid forward-directed silence of a mother whose entire body was a controlled explosion. He texted Park. Find her. Nobody touches anything until I'm there. Call the police. He could feel Park's surprise through the screen even before the response came back. In 30 years of operating in the structure he'd built, Kang Min Jae had never voluntarily called the police. The organization handled its own problems. That was the foundational principle. Park's response? Understood. Are you sure? He was sure. Call them, he sent back, and get me the address. The address came through 6 minutes into the drive. A residential property in Mapogu registered to another shell company, this one 3 layers deep, which Park's team had cracked through the partial plate, and a traffic camera network that the organization had quiet access to through an arrangement with a city infrastructure contractor. Serena Vale was there. Park had confirmed a vehicle matching her personal driver's registered plate in the property's private garage. Min Jae told the driver the address and then put his phone in his lap and looked at his hands for a moment. They were steady now. The adrenaline vibration from earlier in the night had resolved into something harder and colder. Not rage, past rage, into the specific operational clarity that had always been his most dangerous state. The state where everything unnecessary fell away and what remained was simply the next required action. He looked at Nia. She was staring straight ahead through the windshield. Her hands were in her lap, fingers interlaced, pressed together so hard the knuckles had gone pale. She hadn't said anything since the lobby. "She's not going to hurt her," he said. Nia turned to look at him. "You don't know that. She needs Amani unharmed. A harmed child makes every charge against her exponentially worse, and she knows it. She's using her as a negotiating position, not a target." He held Nia's gaze. "She's going to try to use her to make me pull the press conference and retract the evidence package. And when you don't, then she runs out of options and the police arrive and it becomes a different kind of problem for her." He paused. "She miscalculated. She's been calculating everything correctly for 3 years, but she miscalculated this one." "How?" "But because she thought taking Amani would make me less willing to expose myself publicly. She thought I'd choose self-preservation." He looked back at the road. "She still doesn't understand that I stopped choosing self-preservation somewhere around the 9th morning of watching a 4-year-old correct my Korean pronunciation." Nia was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "If she's scared, she won't be. Amani wakes up confused, and then she handles confusion by asking questions until she understands the situation. She's going to ask the aide 14 questions about where she is before she decides to be worried." He paused. "She's going to ask for Constance." Something broke in Nia's face. Just briefly, just along one edge. And then she pressed her lips together and looked back at the windshield and held herself together with the specific ferocity of someone who has learned that falling apart is a luxury the situation cannot afford. He reached across the center console and put his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. The property was a narrow 4-story residential building set back from the street behind a walled garden. Old construction, the kind of building that had private internal staircases and thick walls, and neighbors who'd been there long enough to understand that not noticing things was a form of neighborly courtesy. Park's vehicles were parked 1 block north. 2 uniformed officers were 1 block south. Han Soo-yeon had made a call from whatever hotel she'd been working from, pulling in a favor from a precinct captain who owed her enough to move quietly on a no-warrant approach and wait for further instruction. It was irregular enough that it would be questioned later. Min-jae intended to make sure Han was protected from the questioning. He and Nia went in through the front gate. Not because it was tactical, because walking through the front gate of a building where his daughter was being held without his permission was a statement about who held the actual power in this situation, and Min-jae wanted Serena to understand that statement from the moment she saw him on the intercom camera. He pressed the buzzer. 30 seconds of silence. Then Serena's voice, through the speaker, with the careful, measured quality of someone who had rehearsed this. "Min-jae, I think we should open the gate," he said. "If you'd just let me." "Serena." His voice was completely flat. "Open the gate, or in 4 minutes, 20 police officers open it for you, and everything you have spent 3 years building becomes the kind of criminal case that doesn't offer negotiated outcomes." A pause. "I am here with Nia Laurent. We are coming inside. You are going to return our daughter. Then you and I are going to have the last conversation we ever have." He leaned slightly toward the intercom speaker. "Open the gate." A long silence. The gate buzzed open. Serena Vale was in the ground floor sitting room when they came in, standing near the fireplace, dressed in black, with the composed elegance of someone who had decided that if this was the end of something, she was going to face it with her presentation intact. She was 40 years old and beautiful in the specific hard way of someone who had weaponized their appearance for long enough that it had become the primary mode. Her eyes moved from Min-jae to Nia, and then back again. Cho Yeon-ji, the aide, was seated on a chair near the wall. She was not meeting anyone's eyes. She looked like someone who had understood, somewhere between the service alley and the sitting room, that the particular calculation she'd agreed to had not fully disclosed all its terms. Amani was on the couch, awake as Min-jae had predicted, sitting cross-legged in the hotel blanket with her arms wrapped around it, not crying, watching the room with those steady, wide eyes that held the specific quality of a child who is frightened but has decided that crying is not the correct response to the situation and is holding that decision together through sheer 4-year-old force of will. When she saw Naya, the force of will dissolved. Mama! Nia crossed the room in 5 steps and had Amani off the couch and against her chest before the word finished landing, one arm wrapped completely around her daughter's small body, her face pressed into Amani's hair. She didn't say anything. She just held her, standing in the middle of the room, and the quality of that silence was the loudest thing in the building. Amani's arms went around Nia's neck. Over her mother's shoulder, her eyes found Min Jae. "You came," she said. Her voice was rough from sleep and the effort of not crying. "I came," he said. She nodded, once, in the specific way she had that meant she was filing something into a permanent category. Min Jae turned to Serena. Serena had been watching the reunion with an expression that he couldn't immediately categorize. Something complex running underneath the composed surface. Something that might have been, in a different life and different circumstances, a version of regret. But she had made too many deliberate choices to arrive at this room for regret to be the dominant note, and within a second the complexity closed back over and she was composed again. "Call off the police," she said. "Let me walk out of the country. Everything I have goes away. The media package, the warrant submission, whatever I still have on the organization. You never hear from me again." Min Jae looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. Something shifted in her face. "Min Jae, you put your hands on my daughter." His voice was quiet and absolute. "There is no version of this conversation where you walk anywhere. If I go down, I take the organization with, take it." He stepped forward, not threateningly, just closing the distance between performance and reality. "Take every piece of it. I'll hand you the files myself." He stopped 4 feet from her. "I'm done protecting the organization from the truth of what it is. I've been done since I stood in my mother's garden and understood what I built myself into." He held her gaze. "Whatever the organization loses when you talk is what it deserves to lose. And whatever I lose is what I deserve to lose. But you are not going to walk out of this building free, and you are not going to use my daughter as a bargaining chip. And you are not going to take one more thing from Nia Laurent for as long as you are drawing breath." Serena stared at him. He could see the calculation running behind her eyes, the assessment of exits, of leverage, of possible angles still available. She was brilliant. She had always been brilliant. The tragedy of her was that she had taken that brilliance and built entirely with it in one direction, toward power, toward control, toward the elimination of anyone who occupied space she wanted. And now the architecture was collapsing inward, and there was nothing underneath it. "You loved me once," she said. The words came out differently from everything else she'd said. Less constructed, more exposed, the way words sound when they escape before the speaker finishes deciding whether to say them. He answered her honestly. "I used you and let you believe it was love. That was a wrong I did you." He held her gaze. "But it doesn't balance what you did to her, nothing does." Serena looked past him to Nia, who was still holding Amani, who was watching the room over her mother's shoulder. Something happened in Serena's face that he'd never seen from her before. Not defeat. She didn't have the vocabulary for defeat, had probably never consciously experienced it, but something that lived next to it. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting for so long and with such complete commitment that the moment the fight ends, the body remembers every cost it deferred. She sat down in the chair near the fireplace. She didn't run. She didn't make another offer. She sat down, and Min Jae called Park. And 6 minutes later, the police came through the front gate. The press conference happened at 9 a.m. Han Soo-yeon's emergency challenge had been filed at 4 and granted at 6:45 by the duty judge, who had looked at the evidentiary package for 20 minutes and then called Lim Dae-sung's personal phone and said 3 sentences that ended Lim's career by 7 a.m. Serena Vale was in federal custody. Cho Yeon-ji had given a full statement at the precinct. The media package she'd prepared for the 4 outlets had been intercepted entirely when the criminal case opened and her legal team folded under the federal hold. Min Jae stood at the podium at 9 o'clock in a dark suit in front of 62 journalists, 4 television cameras, and a room full of people who had spent 30 years operating around Kang Min Jae and were now present to witness whatever this was. Ji-wook's statement was in his jacket pocket. He'd read it 3 times in the car. It was thorough and accurate and carefully constructed to accomplish everything legally necessary. He left it in his pocket. He looked at the cameras. He talked for 22 minutes without notes. He described the original conspiracy against Nia Laurent in complete detail. The fabricated evidence, the forged transfers, the staged photographs, the chain of coordination between Serena Vale and Madame Kang. He confirmed the federal investigators' existing evidence against the Crimson Serpent's financial operations and named 3 of his own lieutenants who had been operating outside the boundaries of what he'd authorized. He described what he had done at the 5th anniversary gala 3 years ago, not as a man who had been deceived, but as a man who had chosen not to look because the evidence fit the narrative his pride required. He said, "I divorced an innocent woman in public. I destroyed her reputation in front of the country. I did not investigate. I chose my ego over the truth, and I let her leave this country alone while she was carrying my child. And I am telling you this not because I expect absolution and not because I believe confession repairs what it describes. I'm telling you this because the alternative is that my daughter grows up in a world where powerful men are permitted to destroy people and never account for it, and I will not allow that world for her." The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet, when the thing happening in them is something nobody had prepared for. He described Amani without using her name. He said that his daughter was 4 years old and had never asked to be part of any of this, and that anyone who attempted to use her image or identity in subsequent coverage should understand that he had both the resources and the specific motivation to make that decision, one they would regret for the rest of their professional lives. He said, "The Crimson Serpents in their current form are done. What happens to the structure from this point forward is in the hands of prosecutors and courts and people who are qualified to make those determinations. I am not going to spend whatever time I have left protecting something that required this much damage to maintain." He stepped back from the podium. He didn't take questions. Madame Kang watched the press conference on television in the east wing of the family compound. She watched it alone. Her usual household staff had been reassigned pending the criminal investigation into her role in the conspiracy, and the compound had a specific quality of emptiness to it. Not the comfortable emptiness of a large house between activity, but the emptiness of a place that has been abandoned by the purpose it was built around. She watched her son speak for 22 minutes. She watched him name her, not viciously, not with theatrical condemnation, just factually, as one of 2 people who had coordinated the construction of a false case against an innocent woman. His voice when he said it had the same flat accuracy it had carried in the garden, and in a way that was worse than if he'd been angry. When the press conference ended, she turned the television off. She sat in the room for a long time. She was not a woman who cried. She had not cried since her husband's death 23 years ago. And she had cried then, not from grief exactly, but from the sudden confrontation with a world in which she was entirely responsible for everything, a world that had previously distributed some portion of that weight to another person. She had looked at that world and understood immediately that she would have to become harder than she'd been, and she had made that decision and lived inside it without apology for 2 decades. She sat in the chair by the window and thought about a little girl she had never met, a little girl with Min Jae's eyes, who was, she understood with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, her grandchild. She thought about Nia Laurent at 29 years old standing in the 5th anniversary gala wearing blue, listening to her husband dismantle her publicly and not collapsing. Standing. The specific image had been in the back of Madame Kang's mind since that night. She'd been in the room, watching, and she had felt something she'd refused to name at the time. Something that required too much revision of the story she'd told herself about necessity. She felt it now, sitting in the empty room. She let herself feel it. It didn't have a clean name. It was too large and too late, and too tangled with everything else she'd spent her life deciding. But it was real, and she was 71 years old, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. And she thought that perhaps the first honest thing she had done in 3 years was to sit in this chair and let it be real, without arguing it into a different shape. She picked up the phone. She did not call Min Jae. She knew she had no standing for that call today, or for many days after. She called her lawyer and told him to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Then she set the phone down and looked at the empty room and let the silence be what it was. The weeks after were not clean. They were not the version of aftermath that comes wrapped in resolution and neat conclusions. The criminal cases opened and moved slowly through the system the way criminal cases do, with continuances and motions and procedural delays and news cycles that covered it intensively for 2 weeks and then moved on to other things while the actual work continued in courtrooms without cameras. Serena Vale's trial was set for 8 months out. Her legal team was excellent, and they were going to make it difficult, and it was going to be the kind of case that took what it took and ended when it ended. Han Soo-yeon was the lead prosecutor. Min Jae had submitted his full cooperation and intended to testify. Lim Dae-sung had resigned from the prosecutor's office and was under separate investigation. Madam Kang negotiated a cooperation agreement. The terms were not light. She accepted them without appeal. Min Jae sold 70% of the Crimson Serpent's legitimate business holdings in a 60-day divestiture process overseen by an independent trustee appointed by the federal court. The remaining 30% was placed in a blind restructuring managed by 3 former executives with no criminal exposure. What emerged from the restructuring was smaller and cleaner and recognizable only partially as what it had been. He lost money. He lost influence. He lost the specific quality of presence that comes from being the most feared person in a room. He found, with some surprise, that he did not miss it. Nia stayed in Seoul for 6 more weeks after the press conference. Not because the situation required it, because Amani had fallen in love with the city in the specific wholehearted way of a 4-year-old who has decided a place belongs to her, and because there were things between Min Jae and Nia that needed to be addressed in the same physical space rather than across a phone line. They were not the things that get resolved in a single conversation. They were the accumulated weight of 3 years of private surviving on her part, and 3 years of not knowing what he'd lost on his. And below that, beneath even the 3 years, the foundational questions about what they had been to each other before the damage, and whether what they had been was solid enough to support anything going forward, and whether solid was even the right word for something that had been built partly from his possessiveness, and her willingness to love someone who hadn't fully understood what love required of him. They talked about those things, not easily, not in long cinematic conversations that resolved into clarity, in fragments, over coffee while Amani was at the hotel play center, in the car between appointments, once for 3 hours in the hotel suite, after Amani was asleep, a conversation that went in 4 different directions and ended not with resolution, but with both of them simply sitting in the same room with the full weight of what was true between them and not trying to make it lighter than it was. He didn't ask her to come back. She'd told him in the Park Hyatt lounge on the first evening that being Amani's father earned him nothing with her, and he had heard that, and he had tried to demonstrate for 6 weeks that he understood it, not as a condition to eventually overcome, but as its own complete truth. She had built herself alone. She had built something extraordinary alone, and she did not need him in the architecture of it, and he did not want to be the kind of man who made himself necessary through the application of pressure. What he wanted, what he had identified somewhere in the weeks since the press conference as the most honest want he'd held in his life, was simply for her to be safe, for Amani to know him, for whatever was real between them to be allowed to exist without being forced or managed or shaped to fit a timeline that served his need for resolution. He told her that, not grandly. In the car, on the way to drop Amani at the play center, while Amani was arguing with herself in the back seat about whether Constance the elephant would prefer the slide or the climbing structure. "I don't have a proposal," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything." Nia looked at him from the passenger seat. "I just want you to know that I understand the difference now," he said, "between wanting someone safe because I need to control the outcome and wanting someone safe because that's what love actually is." He kept his eyes on the road. "I wasted 3 years learning that. I'm not going to waste whatever comes next on the wrong version." Nia was quiet for a while. From the back seat, Amani announced that Constance had decided on the climbing structure because she was brave. "Brave is a good reason," Min Jae said to the rearview mirror. "I know," Amani said, with complete confidence. Nia looked out the passenger window. He could see the edge of her face, the slight lift at the corner of her mouth that she was not entirely suppressing. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. He nodded. "Okay." "Not about coming back," she clarified. "Just in 6 months. Ask me where we are." "Okay," he said again. She took Amani back to London on a Tuesday morning in December. The city was cold in the specific way it gets in December. The same cold as November, but with less surprise in it, settled into itself. Min Jae drove them to Incheon. He carried Amani's bag and one of the rolling suitcases, and Amani walked between them in her yellow coat holding one hand each, which she had been doing with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks in a way that seemed partly intentional and partly just the practical logistics of a 4-year-old navigating a world sized for larger people. At the departures entrance, he set the bags down. Amani looked at him with those eyes that were going to be his for the rest of his life. "You're going to call," she said. It was not a question. "Every night," he said. "Even when I'm asleep?" "I'll leave a message." She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced Constance, slightly battered, one ear restitched with what looked like blue thread. She held the elephant out to him. He looked at it. "She helped before," Amani said. "When things were hard. You can borrow her again." His throat closed. He took the elephant, held it the same way he'd held it the first time, in both hands, with the specific gravity of an object whose value had nothing to do with what it was made of. "Thank you," he said. Amani patted his knee. The same flat-palm double pat she'd used the very first morning, the small adult comfort gesture that had undone him then and undid him now. Then she turned and took her mother's hand and walked toward the entrance doors with the decisive forward movement of someone who had made her peace with the goodbye and was ready for whatever came next. Nia paused at the doors. She turned back. She looked at him for a moment, just looked, the way she had across the ballroom 7 weeks ago, with that measured, unsurprised steadiness that had always seen him more completely than he was comfortable with. But this time, there was something else underneath it. Something that had been building through 6 weeks of difficult, honest conversation and shared mornings and the slow accumulation of his showing up not as the feared head of the Crimson Serpents, but simply as a man who was trying to be worth the chance he'd been given. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, once, slightly. The specific nod that meant she'd seen something and was filing it in the permanent category. Then she turned and walked through the doors. He stood at the departures entrance until the sliding doors closed behind them. Then he stood there a while longer. He was holding a stuffed elephant named Constance in both hands outside an international terminal in December, and he was alone, and the city behind him was enormous and continuous and indifferent in the way cities are, and he understood with the clarity that only arrives after everything has cost what it costs that this was not the end of anything. It was just the first morning of the version of himself that the damage had made possible. The car was where he'd left it. He walked back to it. He got in. He sat for a moment with the elephant in his lap. Then he took out his phone and called Amani's number. Not to reach her, she was already in the terminal, already through security by now, probably, but to leave the first message, the one he'd promised, so that when she landed in London and turned her phone on, there would already be something waiting. It rang twice and went to her voicemail, which was Nia's voice saying Amani's name, and then a long pause, and then Amani's voice saying, "Leave a message," with the emphasis on the leave that suggested this was a rule she took seriously. He said, "It's Min Jae. You're probably on the plane now. I hope Constance is keeping you company. She's here with me and she's doing fine. I'll call tomorrow. Sleep well." He ended the call. Sat for another moment. Then he told the driver to take him home, and the car pulled into the long gray Seoul morning, and the city moved around him in its usual way, completely unchanged by the person he was becoming inside it. 6 months later, at the end of May, when Seoul had shaken off the last of the cold and the Han Riverside parks were running green again, and the evenings had the particular softness of a city remembering that it could be beautiful when it tried, Min Jae flew to London. Not for a meeting, not for any scheduled obligation. He bought flowers from a shop near Paddington that Amani had described to him over the phone. Purple ones, she'd said, the kind with the long stems, the ones Mama sometimes puts on the kitchen table. He found them without too much difficulty. He stood on the pavement outside with the flowers in one hand and his phone in the other and texted, "I'm outside, no agenda, just 6 months." The reply took 4 minutes. "Third floor, buzz 3B." He stood at the door and buzzed 3B. Inside, faintly, he heard footsteps. Uneven ones, quick, small, unmistakable. Then Amani's voice through the intercom, with the absolute authority of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 6 months and has planned exactly how it should open. "What's the password?" He thought about it. Constance, he said. A pause. Then the door buzzed open. He walked up 3 flights of stairs, and when the door of 3B opened, it was Amani in a striped sweater and paint-stained trousers who had clearly been in the middle of something creative and had abandoned it at speed, and behind her, in the light of a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something baking, was Nia Laurent watching the doorway with her arms crossed, and the beginning of a smile that she was not trying very hard to suppress. The purple flowers. The 3rd floor. The evening light falling through the windows of a London flat onto a life that had been built entirely without him. He held the flowers out to Amani, who accepted them with the gravity they deserved, and then looked past her to Nia. 6 months, he said. Nia unfolded her arms. Come in, she said, and Kang Min-jae stepped through the door.